Thanks everyone for joining us in another sort of session of our 0 to 1 series at IMC's YLF. Thank you so much, Pramath, for taking the time out to be here with us on a Friday evening. Before I introduce you, I just take a couple of minutes to sort of set the context of our session and program, and then we can get started. As a bunch of you might know who've joined us for these sessions, YLF is the youth forum of IMC's Chamber of Commerce. A chamber that's been representing the interests of Indian business and commerce for almost the last 100 years. And as part of this, we have the 0 to 1 series, which is designed to be some sort of a entrepreneurship boot camp, where we have a lot of exciting, hardened set of speakers across sort of the founder profiles as well as the investor profiles. So some of our sessions have been with Weber from Better Capital, Akshay from Bombay Shirt Company, Siddharth from Farm Easy, and so on and so forth. So for those of you who could join for that, thanks for being here again. Today, in particular, it's my pleasure to host Mr. Pramath Sinha. Pramath was a founding dean of ISB, is the co-founder of both the Harappa Education Group and Ashoka University. He was also previously CEO of AVP Group and a partner in McKinsey. So of course, extremely distinguished career across a whole host of different hats that he's worn. So thanks a ton, Pramath, for taking the time to join us today. Pramath's going to speak with us on product market fit and his emotional and sort of mental journey as he went through all of these different hats. So again, thanks for being here with us, Pramath.
Thank you for having me, Angad. Thank you very much. Great to be here.
What we'll do today, folks, is we'll run this as a predominantly Q&A session. So of course, we have a lot of interesting questions to run by Pramath, but as you think of anything, please do post it in our chat, and we'll take it up one by one. Pramath, to get started with you, you were a founding dean at ISB. In a manner, having looked at your journey a little bit, it seems to be sort of the first entrepreneurial jump in some way, even though it happened as a hybrid while you were at McKinsey. Could you walk us through the ideation for ISB? I'm sure it wasn't just that 1 year where you were founding dean, but it was a couple of years coming. What was the gap that you saw? What was the process of setting it up? Could you walk us through that journey for you?
Thanks, Angad. I think firstly, it's great to be here again. And there were two very important insights in your question, which we haven't talked, so obviously you picked up. One was that it was really the first time that I was doing something entrepreneurial. By the way, I didn't realize it then that it was entrepreneurial. And of course, there was a very sharp focus on the problem we were trying to solve and the need and the gap in the market that we were trying to fill. And that has been one of my biggest lessons and has driven everything I have done since then. And again, I didn't learn that lesson in that way till much later. But now looking back, we were very, very focused on the gap. The gap, Angad, if I wanted to say it informally, without being quoted outside this group, was that what do people who aspire to go to an IIM, in those days, remember there were 3 IIMs, A, B, and C, who don't make it, what do they do? And by the way, I was one of those people who, after my undergraduate degree, was aspiring to be an MBA from one of the IIMs, and I didn't make it. Now, what do you do? There were 2 alternatives, or rather 3 alternatives. One was that you settle for a next institution, and the next institution was much further down in kind of the quality and the pecking order and so on, and with no offense to anybody who went to any of those other institutions, but there was a perceived gap. This is a different kind of gap that from the question you're asking, right. From IIM ABC to the next institution. So you could go to one of those institutions, but you felt somewhere that, hey, I'm much better than, I deserve better than those institutions. At least that was the mentality that would affect people. The second option was you go abroad. But then even in those days, that's like $150,000 commitment, which most people were not willing to or couldn't afford. Very few people could afford. Or you do nothing, you just continue to work. Right. And we saw that the IIMs were just not expanding capacity. So the three IIMs in those days used to have a total intake of about 200 each, so about 600 people. So if you look, the big gap was in the, if I can be provocative in saying, there's the people who were rejected by the IIMs. There were many, many good people, and they deserved to go to an IIM A, B, C, but there wasn't enough capacity. And that's the gap we saw. And we said, we are going to solve for a high quality MBA in India at a third of the cost of going abroad. Much more expensive than an IIM, but at a third of a cost of going abroad. But here in India with a much lower opportunity cost of a 1-year MBA rather than a 2-year MBA. So that was the solution we designed for the gap. And I don't want to get ahead of the problem, but of the answer. But that's really the gap we were trying to address.
And you said we. So what did the we consist of? Because of course you were at McKinsey when this was going on. So how, what was the group of stakeholders that actually came together to ideate on this problem? And how did you actually come together?
Yeah. So Angad, there was a bunch of different people who were working on this, but there was the board of ISB, which was a bunch of Indian business owners. In those days, there were no real entrepreneurs. They were sort of family owners,
right,
and professional CEOs who were on the board, but they were not actually involved in this part of the problem solving and ideation. They were saying, hey, we want to help build an institution in India.
Right.
Most of the problem solving was done by a group of us at McKinsey, led by Rajat Gupta, but the working McKinsey team, you know how consultants work. So we had an engagement manager, which was the role I was playing, and there was a bunch of young people under me. And we were working very closely with some academics in the US. I think that was the sort of problem solving team. And I include the academics because there was a lot of debate in the answer, the finding of the answer. Identifying of the gap, I think we in India, the McKinsey team had done.
Right.
The few of us who, I was much younger then. So I'd been, my CAT experience or trying to get into an MBA was about 15 years old or less at that time. So that failure in CAT still rankled, right? And then there were a lot of people in McKinsey who had gone through the IIM system. So they knew how they had good friends and classmates and people they had done their undergrad with or worked with, who they thought were really deserving, but couldn't get an MBA and were languishing because they couldn't afford to go abroad.
And, you jumped in and you were the founding dean, right? You could have easily kind of played a board or an ideation role. What made you actually say, I wanna go do this for the next year or two and build this ground up?
Well, the real story is that I was the backup guy. I was the night watchman or 12th man, whatever analogy you want to use. What happened was, Angad, that our plan was to put some real heavy hitters as the leaders of this institution. And so we did find 2 heavy hitters. You all are too young, but in those days, there was a very famous Indian management academic by the name of Sumantra Ghoshal. Sumantra had a PhD from MIT, had taught at Harvard, INSEAD, London Business School. He was very celebrated. A little bit like in today's day and age, an Adam Grant or a Ram Charan or, pick your favorite sort of business academic. So he was very famous and he had agreed to be the founding dean of ISB, by the way. He was at LBS at that time. And we had, in fact, a surfeit of riches because Deepak Jain, who was the deputy dean at Kellogg, also wanted to come. So we made him an executive dean. We almost created a new title and said, oh, we'll have 2 people. Why have 1 celebrity? Let's do 2.
Right.
What happened was that as the time came closer and closer to the launch of the school, Sumantra developed cold feet. He was this very flamboyant, ideas man, and he felt very boxed in as an administrator. So he said, listen, you already have Deepak. This is not for me. I'll come and teach at the school. I'll be a well-wisher. I'll come, but leave me out of it. So that was a bit of a shock to us. But we said, okay, fine. He's not going away anywhere, and we'll be able to manage with him not being there because we had Deepak.
Right.
Then come May, which is a couple of months before the July 1 start of the class, Deepak Jain becomes Dean of Kellogg.
Right.
So suddenly we are left without a leader, and we are less than 60 days from launch. And that's when the board said that, hey, you've been with this project right from the beginning. You have a PhD. And I knew all the students. The students were up in arms because they were coming to ISB as a new institution, knowing that Sumantra and Deepak were going to be there like almost a surrogate parent, right? Taking them through the first year. And suddenly the two people they really knew who were going to be there with them had made promises to them, had decided to renege on that commitment. So the students were up in arms. But I was one person they knew because I had been involved in the whole marketing process. I had been doing outreach. I had been presenting the ISB idea. I had been doing admissions interviews. So I knew these guys intimately.
Right.
So the board, and I think it was a wise decision. And of course, that decision changed my life. Even though I was involved from the beginning, I don't think I would be so well known as I am today as for that 1 year. Which, by the way, is unfair because I'm still involved in ISB 25 years later. And every Saturday morning at 8 a.m., I still do a call with the ISB dean today. But the point is that everybody thinks of me as that 1 year founding dean guy. So yeah, that's how I became the dean. And fortunately, there was a little bit of nepotism because Rajat Gupta, who was the chairman of the ISB board, was also the head of McKinsey at that time. So he wrangled a sabbatical for me, which I don't think McKinsey would have given otherwise. So that also helped.
And what a relaxing sabbatical you must have had. So what were some of the challenges that you faced in building an institution ground up, particularly as you said, right? The students were in some ways expecting a certain brand image that some of these folks would have brought to it, which was unfortunately reneged on. So what were some of the challenges that you
That was the first challenge, Angad. It's like you get hired into a company where the founder and CEO says, hey, come work for me, Angad, leave your job at Bain, forget the consulting track, come and be an entrepreneur with me. And then the founder says, I'm leaving, right? So the students were quite disappointed with that. The second big challenge was that our infrastructure was not ready when we started the launch. Like any project in India, it was a massive construction site.
Right.
So that was one big challenge. But the biggest and the far biggest challenge I faced, and could be one of the biggest challenge and the biggest lesson I learned in my life, was that 9/11 happened. And that the job market completely went to tatters. The bottom dropped after the market. People had come to ISB expecting that they would get consulting and investment banking jobs. Goldman Sachs, Citibank, HSBC, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch were all on our board. McKinsey, of course, was there, and people expected that they would hire. And 9/11 happened, and we were built on this visiting faculty model where faculty flew in from outside to come and teach. And remote teaching didn't exist like today.
Right.
So a lot of faculty couldn't travel from the US to teach during that time because airports shut down, travel got restricted. People were just scared to travel. In those days, you may not remember, but it was like, fearing COVID. Today, it was like, hey, if I get on a plane, what's the guarantee that there's not going to be another bomb or attack? So people were very scared. And like I said, there were no jobs. So it became a very tough year. And I don't think I've worked so hard in my life getting people jobs as I did in that 1 year. But yeah, those are some of the big challenges we faced. And then there were many other challenges. The fact is that, when the monsoons came, people's roofs started leaking. And that was the start of the social media boom, right? So people started writing about it on social media. Our only international student was brushing his teeth one day, and the mirror he was standing with in his room fell and shattered, and he put out I don't know what it was, a tweet or there was no Twitter in those days, but a post saying, this is what happened to me and so on. So these kinds of things would happen. But I think the biggest challenge was 9/11 and the bottom dropping out of the job market that year.
Got it. So that's such a myriad set of challenges too, right? Some of it has to do with the image, some of it has to do just with the operational challenges of doing pretty much any kind of business.
I will say one last thing, which is a very much part of every entrepreneur's journey, and it happened to me as well. We were very well funded, and we always have. But I remember that the stock market also crashed in roughly in 99, 2000, the big internet bubble burst. So the donors started to feel poorer. And usually what happens is they are not losing. I mean, people are poorer. They are not exactly poor.
Right.
So they want to hold back on their commitments because they say, you know, my shares have come down in value or my wealth has come down. So maybe I'll donate once it all comes back. Why should I give away money right now, right? So we ran out of cash at some point. I literally had zero cash to pay the bills. And I had to call up Anil Ambani, who was on our board and very much to say, hey, can you just give me some cash to pay salaries this month? And, you know, this is the kind of stories you hear from entrepreneurs, but that literally happened at ISB. I remember there was a payroll I couldn't meet, and I had to beg, borrow for that.
That's amazing. I mean, just to see where, you know, how far we've come from there. To give folks context, at Bain, I think it's the first year where we've actually hired more people cumulatively from one school, which is ISB, than a lot of IIMs to put together. So that's. And
amazing. By the way, I have a story on that. If you want me to tell that.
Absolutely.
So the story is that Bain and BCG refused to hire because they said it's a McKinsey school.
Right.
McKinsey has built this school for themselves. We are not going to hire them. So BCG I somehow cracked because Janmejay Sinha is from my school in Patna. Though we are Sinhas, we are remotely related, but it wasn't that. It was just that he was from my school, and it was more Arun Maira who I knew well. So I called Arun and he said, listen, Pramod, the truth is we are good friends, but everybody here is against. And the IIM mafia was very strong, right? So even within McKinsey, the McKinsey guys were saying, why should we hire these IIM rejects, right? So with BCG, I told Arun that I will send you 6 CVs, you shortlist, and I will fly them to Bombay. You don't have to come, right? So that worked, and they actually hired Anshuman Goenka in that class, and that was a huge victory for me. But Bain, I could not convince. And I didn't have any good connections at Bain. And Bain, we kept trying. Legions of ISB administrators tried, till I became good friends with Srini, who was your chairman a couple of years ago. So one day, Srini and I were on a flight together from Chennai. And as you know, the Chennai to Delhi flight is a long flight. So for 2.5 hours, I literally sat with Srini, and I was saying, Srini, why am I doing this? 20 years later, I'm trying to still convince you to hire from ISB. I mean, give me a break. And then where I really got him was, he said that Bain had hired ISB alums, but not from campus. I said, come on, yaar, you are a management consultant. There's a flaw in this logic, right? What do you have against the school if you are hiring those guys a few years later, right? So I did a Bain on him, or a McKinsey on him. And that's how the recruiting from Bain started.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. It's a crazy
and now,
journey.
of course, amazing. Yeah. And I tell you, that happened 3 years ago, I think, 2-3 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. For the first time ever. And he also told me that, you know, we don't go because it's a McKinsey school. I said, now, come on, you can't now keep saying that it's a McKinsey school. And I told him that, you know, it's basically a IIM bias. I'll tell you, I said, I faced that in McKinsey, and I know that's what's going on. Your partners are all from IIMs, and they will never allow ISB to come in as long as they can get people from IIMs. And anyway, so that's a sweet story and a sweet victory for me. And of course, Srini and I are good friends, and I'm glad it's been a great experience.
It has. It's been a great experience for us. So it's a lovely journey to hear about. Just switching tracks a little bit, you then went ahead and did something else entrepreneurial. You went and set up 9.9 Media, which is a kind of company you're still involved in, which is slightly different than what you've done, you know, since then around the education space. So can you walk us through what was the thinking around that? What kind of got you to do that after the ISB experience and from McKinsey?
Yeah, so let me backtrack a little bit. A lot of my work at McKinsey was in media.
Okay.
And I've always been fascinated by media because I actually come from a publishing family in my childhood. So my father had a printing press, and we would print a magazine and books and textbooks and so on. So I've lived the kind of media life. I've always been fascinated by movies and video. I can watch any video, anything moving on a screen, I can spend hours watching. So when I was working in North America with McKinsey, I was fortunate enough to get the opportunity to work on some very interesting media projects and got my first exposure to media as a business.
Right.
So when I came to India, this was the Wild West from a consulting standpoint in those days. So you would go after whatever area you had some expertise in. And because I had some expertise or some background in doing media work, I got involved in a lot of media work here, and then went on to serve the Anand Bazar Patrika group. And then they invited me to be their CEO and so on. Well, as it turns out, my decision to go to Anand Bazar Patrika didn't quite work out, because after about 18 months, I decided to part ways with them. And then I was left high and dry. I didn't have a job and I resigned. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. Now, this was the time of another big financial boom just before the bust, the big financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Things had started to crumble in the West, but that crisis had not reached India yet. So everybody saw me as a guy who was worth funding, whether I wanted to be an entrepreneur or not. And this was my first big lesson, that sometimes you can actually have good money chasing bad people. I was not fit to be an entrepreneur, if you really ask me. But people were willing to sign me checks, and there were some very big discussions I was having where people were talking big numbers. And I was like, hello, why would you give me so much money? What am I going to do with this money? And I was also getting a little bit carried away that if I had this money, what would I do with it, right? So I was creating complicated business plans and so on. But I did decide that I was too spoiled after many years at McKinsey. And given my experience at Anand Bazar, I also realized that I really couldn't work in an Indian company or with a company. I'm generally not a difficult or an arrogant guy. I mean, it's pretentious to say even that, but just quite frankly, I don't think I am. But I was also finding that I was too black and white about how I wanted to do things, and that it might not work in a large organization. And I said, therefore, I have left with no choice but to be an entrepreneur. I think I got into entrepreneurship for all the wrong reasons. And these are all the wrong reasons to get into it. Then this consulting mindset that, oh, I'm so smart that I can turn around any business, right? So because I didn't have a business idea, or I wasn't quite passionate, one of the things that was happening was a lot of investment bankers were coming to me with deals and saying, why don't you buy this company and turn it around? Or this company is struggling, this is ideal for you to take over. And so Kotak Mahindra Bank and the partner there, who had already been in touch with me when I was at ABP, brought me this deal to take over a company called Jasubhai Digital Media, which was bleeding. And he had brought it to me when I was a CEO that ABP should buy it. And now it hadn't gotten sold after about 6, 7, 8 months. And he said, listen, you can have it for zero money, which was some value at 60 crores or something he was trying to sell me a few months earlier. So I thought, okay, this is a good deal, right? Even though the company is bleeding, maybe I can turn it around. I'll get a 17 crore business. I remember it's losing about 3, 4, 5 crores of cash, but there's still 17 crores of real revenue. So maybe I can turn it around. And as I was doing all this, Helion Venture Partners, who I had been talking to, said, yeah, we'll fund you. We'll give you 30 crores or 40 crores, whatever it is. So here I was, never been an entrepreneur other than ISB, like you pointed out. Not really my idea, not something I felt passionate about, but the starry-eyed notion that, I'm going to turn this company around and create value, which they teach you, I guess, in case studies and business school and management books. But I'd never really done that. And an investment banker who was willing to give you a good deal, and a funding guy who was willing to give you money. All this came together and boom, I was up and running, and we had a business and so on. So that's how I became an entrepreneur. Do you want to know what happened?
Yeah, I would love to know what happened. So what happened from there?
No, so the problem with consulting is, and I'm sorry to say this, but you are also one, and some of the people, you can create a solution for anything, right? You think you are super problem solvers, so you can come up with the problem, a solution to a problem, right? So I created a business plan for us to be 500 crores or whatever in 5 years, or in those days, it was probably more like 10 years. Nowadays, business plans have to be there in 3 years or something. In those days, 500 crores in 10 years, how we would do it. And, this was the specialty media business. And, I created a pretty nice plan and so on, which is why the money came in. But there were 2 or 3 things that were going on. Number one, Angad, I've learned, don't do a business that you're not passionate about. Right? It was not my idea. It was a business that I acquired. And I'm not a turnaround guy. I mean, you can, and all of us can be a turnaround guy, but I was not really passionate about turning things around. It was not like that was what I was passionate about.
Right.
Or this specialty media part, which is kind of the cottage industry of media, right? I was a big media guy, mass media guy, right? And this was like playing at the fringes. Then the internet disruption was coming, right? And what has happened with the internet disruption is that it has completely destroyed the media business, as you can see.
Yeah.
And it's not clear how you make money in the news part of that business, right? Or the content part of that business. Entertainment with Netflix and so on is starting to make money now, but it's been like 20 years on. Right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, all traditional media finished, right? Destroyed. And there are a few leaders who are still making money, but the rest are completely finished. And I can talk about that. So I got hit by the storm of that disruption. And then the stock market crash happened. The big financial crisis happened. So money dried up. And the last thing was, turning around a company is not what people make it out to be in movies and books. It takes the mickey out of you, right? When you are losing cash month on month, right? Turning that around to actually make it break even and so on just takes it's the hardest thing to do. Hats off to people who are able to do it. Right? So we really struggled. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, please. No, what I was saying is, so of course, a lot of this is, you mentioned by own admission, that you look back on and sort of and glean from your reflections. But was it something, and at what point in that journey did you actually say, let me acknowledge to myself that this is not something I'm passionate about, and let me focus my energies on areas where my passion does lie. So how that kind of shift happened for you?
So honestly, a couple of things happened to me. One was that I've always been a multitasker. Okay, I wouldn't advise this for everyone, but I've always been a multitasker. So the thing that happened was that my solution to being bored with something is to not give up on it, but find something else to do that keeps me inspired. So what happened with me was that Ashoka happened on the side. So I was actually doing both things. I was building 9.9 and Ashoka. And then Ashoka really took off, right? In fact, Ashoka would not have happened if I hadn't left ABP. I keep saying ISB. And I didn't have anything to do and I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, right? So that kept me going on 9.9. I kept trying and, I had a team, 5 people from ABP came, they joined me, they were all doing fine. So even though the company was not scaling up, I was quite happy that I was not having to fire people. And I had brought it to a level where we were actually making decent amount of money. So for about 7-8 years, this went on. We scaled up. We went down to some 60 crores in revenue and so on. And we had some good years, some bad years, but it was clear that I would not be able to take it to 500 crores, let alone take it to 100 crores. Right. And the structural challenges became very clear to me that structurally, it was not possible to scale this business. And that's the other big thing that I've learned is to keep hammering away at the point, what will it take to scale the business? Unless you are doing a lifestyle business and you're running a store or a small service. This question, I did not appreciate the nuance of that, scaling is important. So now these are very valuable lessons for me at Harappa and I'm applying them now. But in those days, in fact, Sanjeev Agarwal at Helion would keep hammering this and I couldn't get it. I wasn't getting it. But now I get it. So I think at some point I did realize that it was not scalable. I think that may have been at the 4, 5, 7-year mark. Then I started to clean up, but cleaning up is not easy. If somebody is not buying, do you just shut down? You don't have the courage to do that. And by then there was ways in which I was making money, but then I decided that no, this is not going to work. So unwinding takes time. So it took a couple of years. And then it was only at about the 7, 8-year mark, about 5 years ago, that I said, listen, if passion is important, then why am I even in this sector? I should be only doing education, because it's very clear to me that that's what I'm passionate about. And by the way, having done ISB, I hadn't quite realized that. If I had realized that, I was actually, the board had told me just continue as dean, and maybe I would have done that. But I didn't realize that that was a passion, and that passion and work and professional and business can actually come together. Somewhere in my mind, education was my pro bono, volunteer, hobby, weekend work, night work, which of course I was very inspired by, but was not willing to acknowledge that that's an area where I could actually build a business and be professionally successful.
Right.
So I'd created all these mental models in my head that, oh, education se paise nahi kamayenge, I will not make that commercial, and I will make my money. And I was still not independently wealthy. I had left McKinsey at a fairly young point, so I had not made the millions that partners make. So I needed to make a living. So there was all these confusion in my head. Once that confusion got resolved, that passion, purpose, work, making money, and all of that can come together, then I started to distance myself from my 9.9 business and get more and more into pure education business. I started a 9.9 education division, which was a for-profit and still continues to do good work. And I started thinking about, if I had to do something in education, what would that be? So started thinking about Harappa and so on. So I think that shift ended up taking a few years. It wasn't easy. Then, I'm a little bit of a, you could call me a softie. I wanted to give a proper exit to people. So I decided that I was going to buy out my investors. A lot of entrepreneurs advised me that, hey, just declare that business didn't work, they'll write it off. And they had probably written it off anyway, financially. But I didn't feel good about that. So I made a commitment to give back part of their money. So I had to earn that over a period of time. I felt guilty about my partners who were with me, who had given up 10 years of their life working with me. I wanted them to have some money.
Yeah.
So all of them are still with me, my partners. They are still, we carved out the business. So each one of them had something to do. Ironically, there's a part of 9.9 Media, which I still own, just 2 brands. And in the last 24 months, they have been hugely successful. They have made more money than I ever made in the previous 10 years of 9.9. So, the vagaries of the business world and how things turn out, nobody can predict. Right? It's all timing. And the main reason is that the part that I now own is really riding the e-commerce boom.
Right. And so you mentioned Ashoka, which is of course a whole interesting topic for us to talk about, which again, similar to ISB, was not, it was an idea in the making with lots of different people thinking about it. You, of course, at the forefront of that with a couple of different people. Can you walk us through that journey? What made you think that now that we've looked at the business side of things, let's look at liberal arts and then how undergrad education is done? So was that really the thinking of, look, I've seen this work in ISB, can I apply the same logic to undergrad?
Yeah, I have to be brief about this because otherwise I'm going to eat up all your time. But quick points, because otherwise I'll speak too much. First thing, I never thought I would do any institution after ISB. I was convinced that this was hard enough. I don't want to do this again. So I was like, this is great job, and a long way to go as well. So really want to be top 10. Even today, my drive is, my ambition is that ISB should be top 10 in the world, and we have a long way to go. So I said, listen, this needs all the attention and it's going to need a lifetime to get there. So why should I distract myself? The second big insight that happened was that I realized that if you create one program, I mean, if you ask me today, ISB is a one-trick pony. It's a 1 year, 12-month MBA program. That's it. Now we do many other things, but if you really ask me, it's the one-trick pony that we had. But you can build so much credibility with that one program in 1 year, which gives you the license to do anything you want. So my big joke is that if we set up a school of nursing at ISB, it would be successful. If we set up a K-12 school, we call it ISB Academy, and set up a K-12 school, it will be successful. Because your credibility in a sector where nobody is credible is so high because you created one quality program that you could literally do whatever you want. The last big insight that I learned, but what was happening was that despite the fact that that credibility was there, my board was not letting me start an undergrad program. And I was very big on saying, listen, we are really going to have impact in India. We have 250 acres of amazing land in Hyderabad. What are we doing? This should be a university. We should be building schools. You know, it could be build a whole ecosystem. Why shouldn't a kid go from grade 1 to BTech or BS to MBA? Right? Why should people have to? So I kept pushing these ideas, and the board was, no. Let's make this business school. And fair enough. I'm not criticizing. I'm saying that was the thinking. So I was already frustrated that we can take this to other programs. The last thing was, one of the things that people don't know is that we were ready to launch ISB in 1997. And we launched in 2001. Why? Because of land, building, infrastructure, how long it takes to get all of this done in India. So I was like, that was such a waste. We could have just started. I realized that all that students in the postgraduate realm care about is a great teacher. You get great students, great teachers together, put them under a tree, you have a program. You don't need infrastructure. So all these thoughts and insights were there in my head. I also realized that our visiting faculty model was a winning idea. Nobody till then had gone and had the courage and the gumption to say that I will build the entire program on visiting faculty. I don't need to hire a single faculty member, and we will just have people visit and we will deliver a program. So all these ideas had become very deeply ingrained in my head. Now, when Ashish Dhawan and Sanjeev Bikhchandani and Vineet Gupta and these guys approached me, I said, okay, I'll help you. I didn't want to get involved because I was still CEO of ABP then. That's when these conversations happened. I didn't have time. I was working in Calcutta and I was like, hey, mujhe ISB karna hai. I don't want to do all this. Right. You guys want to, and a lot of people were approaching me that help me. And I was like, listen, I'm focused on building the top business school in the world. I don't care what you guys are doing. You want my help? I'll give you my help. But then what happened is I left ABP and I was back in Delhi and I kept meeting and having lunches and dinners with these guys. And then I realized that these guys are really struggling. A lot of these, the confidence that I had that it can be done, we can build a top-notch school and so on, they were struggling with much as we had many years ago, right?
Yeah.
So I got these two groups together and I said, then they said, so I first said that, listen, why don't you guys work together? Because you are both trying to set up a university and land, infrastructure, regulations, is a lot of problems. You are like-minded people, same values. Why don't you come together? One wanted to do liberal arts, one wanted to do tech. So they said, okay, we'll come together if you come with us. So they flipped that back to me. By then I had gotten involved with them enough to say, listen, this may be a good idea for me to put my teeth into. And then I said, okay, I'll get involved. That time we had very ambitious plans, and like any business, a big crisis hit us, which was 2007, 2008. So we were trying to raise 1,000 crores and build a multidisciplinary campus with engineering, liberal arts, management, medicine, law. We were very ambitious. And then this thing happened, and again, the bottom went out of all our fundraising. So then Sanjeev Bikhchandani and Ashish Dhawan stepped up and they said, listen, we will underwrite this if you guys do only liberal arts, because that was our original idea. That is the part that was the camp they came from.
Right.
I was always sold on the liberal arts idea because I went for my PhD to UPenn, and Penn being a Ivy League liberal arts school, even though I did my engineering PhD, I saw the merits of a liberal art education. And I also had liberal arts kind of thinking in me. My sisters, my parents, you know, my father is a writer, my sisters did English literature. So I had exposure to that. And then in McKinsey, I got an exposure to that because I was a diversified hire at McKinsey. We were called non-MBAs, right? We were paid less. We were an experiment. So I used to work in the Toronto office, which was the hotbed of all the non-MBA hires. We were all pooled in there. We were almost like a Manchurian experiment, right? So I got to see that, hey, even without an MBA, we were all doing really well. And there were history majors, sociology majors, and that this thing doesn't matter. And anyway, I was an undergrad in metallurgy. What the hell was I doing in a management consulting job with no MBA? So I was always sold on it. And when this idea came along, I said, we'll do it. But then the challenge was, how do we do it in a bootstrapped manner when we don't have money? That's when the ISB insight helped a lot. The logic that I walked you through, I said, let's make the Young India Fellowship that equivalent of the one-year ISB program. This will be our one-trick pony. And if we can actually establish our reputation with this one-trick pony, then within 3 years, by then we'll try and find land and infrastructure. Let's do it in a rented facility. So I took that insight about not having to wait 4 years. We rented a campus in central Delhi, launched the program. It was a clone of the ISB 1 year in the liberal arts domain, made sure that that became hugely successful. And that gave us the same credibility that ISB got to say, okay, now we'll launch other programs.
Right.
So that's how that whole thing got born. And of course, the liberal arts gap in the country was very clear. I didn't focus on that. I think everybody is frustrated about the fact that our young people can't think for nuts. They are very poor communicators. We are not building the right values, right? And they are out of touch with reality. That's what the liberal arts education really does. Again, like in the case of ISB, people were sending people abroad for higher studies, which was very expensive. Getting into Stephens and Xavier's has become increasingly difficult with 100% marks. So it was the same gap that we saw. If you didn't get into a LSR, Stephens, Xavier's, the only option of a good education was to go abroad, which was very expensive. Few people could do that. So this was the gap that we were meeting.
So you're right. I think of course, the supply gap existed, and to some degree, it actually to a large degree, it still exists today as well, right? Even after these two institutions that have done really well. The couple of things that I'd love, your inputs and feedback on is, you mentioned that one of the things you realized over time was scalability. Now, of course, setting up a higher education institute is a pretty hard thing to scale because there's so many different things involved. There's the regulatory side of it, the land side of it. You can't really go about and keep building colleges as easily as you do software, for example. And likewise, on the credibility and trust side of it, I'd imagine it would have been a little bit harder than when you did ISB, because with ISB, the idea of an MBA was very much ingrained in the sort of traditional Indian mindset of a means to get a job. Whereas liberal arts is something that even today, when you talk to parents, it is something that is new to folks, right? So I'd imagine, 5-10 years ago, it would have been even newer to folks. So how did you actually think about combating both of those aspects of this business?
So Angad, the truth is that selling the ISB MBA was also very difficult. Because people said, what is this 1 year MBA?
Right.
Nobody in India had heard of a 1 year MBA. So they would say, what is this 1 year MBA? And is this really an MBA? You guys are cheating. Then they would say, well, you have no accreditation, no recognition. So this is just a paper certificate. This is not a PGDBM or PGDM. Then they would say, well, what kind of jobs will these people get? Because they now have experience. So you are taking people with 3-4 years of experience. Then you are giving them 1 year. Then you are giving them a piece of paper. How will they get a job? Will they get a job with McKinsey? Will McKinsey hire them? Will Unilever hire them? So there, it was tough too. Don't. And this is a new program.
Yeah.
What is the guarantee that this will work? And you are a bunch of business guys. What do you know about education? So again, I'm not trying to be defensive. I'm just saying that I had seen that challenge. So that made me a little bit fearless, to be honest. Okay, I was not as daunted by that task. I also knew that the only way to attack this question is to stand up in front of parents and say with conviction that this will work. I'm going to make it work, right? Trust me, right? And of course, you have all the logical arguments that, so-and-so, Indra Nooyi became CEO of Pepsi and so on. You can give those examples of liberal arts majors who went on to do great things and so on. But then people will say, India mein nahi hota hai, it's outside. So there are always arguments. But I think ultimately you have to look people in the eye and say, trust me. But there's one other thing, Angad, that goes back to the question that you are asking, which is more a question for an entrepreneur, right? Is there a felt need in the market or not? Yes, you have to create the market, but is there some inkling, some twinkling of a need? And that has been there, right? And it's surprising, you will realize that need is there inherently in students. See, there are some enlightened parents who know, and there's a very few elite enlightened parents who say, okay, I give my children a liberal arts education. They are familiar with the West and, they've gone abroad. So that group is there. But you'll be surprised. And I give a quintessential example of this guy in Pondicherry, the son of a single mother. Mother is a teacher in a school. He was a topper in his school, went to a Kendriya Vidyalaya. He went through all possible programs that he could go to, and he said, none of these are for me. He actually sat at home for 1 year, this chap. He was in our founding class at Ashoka. His mama from Calcutta wrote to him saying, Beta, you have decided to waste 1 year. He basically took a gap year. Okay. He said, Beta, you've decided to take a gap year. Why don't you check out this new university called Ashoka? He read our curriculum and he said, my God, this is what I want to do. And he was in our first founding batch. Guy from the most unlikeliest of backgrounds and quarters that you and I would not expect. And I can give you hundreds of stories. In the first batch, we had 128 students, and they were all either from enlightened parents or IB programs or people who were already exposed to liberal arts and were predisposed, or these were absolutely raw, instinctive students who wanted this. Chakshu Chhabra, who went to Nabha Public School in Patiala. Her brother is a software engineer, as quintessential techie, nerd, engineer path that you can get, right? Working in a software firm in Mohali. She calls him up and says that in my school, there was a presentation by this is a small liberal arts college. These liberal arts colleges from America are very aggressive. They find their way into all these colleges. So some guy from some liberal arts college came and gave a presentation, and Chakshu said, hey, this is what I want to do. So he calls up her brother. Her brother says, ye kya hota hai liberal arts? Mujhe nahi malum. He said, bhaiya, please, I don't have internet access. Aap thoda khoj ke batao. This guy calls up his sister 2 days later and he said, India mein 2 universities hai, Flame University and Ashoka University. She applies, we see her application, we love it. I interviewed this girl. She came all the way from Nabha with her father, who's a shopkeeper who could not speak with me because I couldn't speak Punjabi. He could not understand my Hindi. We couldn't communicate in English, but Chakshu blew us that day in the interview. And of course, she completed. So you will be surprised to know that in a country of 1.6 billion people, it's not surprising that, people want to do different things. Right. I've now since gone to set up design universities and so on. I'll tell you, the kids will blow your mind. They know exactly what they want to do. They will tell their parents. And your discussion is mostly with the parents. Kids are convinced. They will come to you and say, Angad, please explain to my parents what liberal arts is.
And when you, of course, it was a long time coming, because there's a lot of insights that you had in the ISV process through your own personal experience, and then you kind of applied that to Ashoka. Was there any amount of empirical customer research on what are the programs you want to set up within liberal arts? How do we actually go about choosing what majors, so to speak, we offer? Or was it also, a lot by the experiences and insights that you had through this journey?
Yeah, that was more instinct. And if you actually look at it, those decisions are very cliched decisions that we took. So if you look at our programs, they were the usual English, history, philosophy, psychology. The interesting thing, Angad, was that within that we innovated. So we did a lot of innovation. So for example, we cherry picked some very interesting things from liberal arts programs around the world. So for example, Columbia has a required course called the Great Books.
Yeah.
Now it's a very exciting course, but by the way, Penn doesn't do great books. The Ivy League are very snooty about wo Columbia karta hai, main nahi karunga. Columbia had for example, a requirement that everybody should learn how to swim in the old days. So, people do quirky things. So we picked up a few of those things. So we brought in great books at Ashoka. But guess what? In the list of 100 books that you can teach from, and by the way, the beauty of the great books is that if Angad teaches great books, he will teach these 6 books. If Yash teaches great books, he will teach these other 6 books, right? But in that list of 6 books, we put Indian texts. We put in Mahabharata. We put in Kama Sutra. We put in Mahatma Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, and so on. So that's where the innovation came in. The innovation was not at the top level. You will still see, but yes, the other innovation, which was innovation for India, but not for the world, we said you can have an undeclared major. We said that you can switch majors. Now, this insight we had. We knew that one of the frustrating things for me, even at an IIT, was everybody in India applies to a major and sticks to that major for the rest of their time in the university. How stupid is that, right? You're not good enough to go to MIT. You're only good enough to study linguistics at MIT. You can't go and take that computer science course if you were good enough. So those are the innovations that we brought in. And that is where having the local context and knowledge helped in saying, and the insight that I had was, and this was my Penn experience, that frankly, 18-year-olds want flexibility and choice.
Yeah.
So what most people assume is, beta tum kya karoge? Like beta knows or beti knows. People don't have a clue what they want to do most of the time. They broadly know what they want to do. But to pin them down and say you must study psychology, or you do some psychometric assessment in class 9 and tell them you should become a journalist, is so unfair. So if you just give people the choice and flexibility, and that was really the big insight that went into designing the programs.
And, as you said, that there were a lot of innovations that have happened. Today, in particular, there's a lot of talk about higher education being stuck in its ways in some ways, and this talk is happening in the West, and so it's even more applicable to places like India. That makes innovations on content and on the means of delivery, as we've been forced to do in the last year or so, even more important. How do you actually keep abreast with these things? Is there a mental model? How do you build those systems and processes in place for a pretty progressive institute like Ashoka to always stay at the forefront of innovating and being relevant?
This is one of the sectors in the world that finds it very difficult to change and innovate. And ironically, as ISB and Ashoka grow older, they have the same affliction that traditional institutions have, because they will find it very difficult. You see, think about the unit, the least common unit or the fundamental unit in these institutions is the faculty member. And our current faculty member, the training does not justify change or flexibility. You are stuck in it for life. In the subject that you are specialized, you are rewarded for that. Right. So these institutions are very change resistant to begin with. And I think they find it harder to change, ironically, as they grow older. So your question is extremely relevant. I don't have an answer to your question. My only answer to your question is, and this is what leads to a lot of conflict and has led to conflict between donors and founders and the institution, is that people like me who are outside the system have to exert pressure. This is where the governance becomes very important. Even if I'm tomorrow gone, the governance model should be such that the people on the board, the trustees, are putting the pressure on making change happen. That's the only way it will work, because inherently academics will find it difficult to usher in lots of change. They are not trained for that. They are actually trained to just focus on one area, go deep into it, do a great job, discover the insights, truths. They are not incentivized to change. So you have to have very strong institutional governance models to drive change. Sorry, go ahead.
Absolutely. The other sort of interesting adjacency to this is also today, for any sort of consumer facing offering, and of course education is a service, and a pretty important, expensive one for lots of folks. But today, for young people, the ethos, the sort of brand associated with it, is very important. And of course, with education comes reputation, trust, etc. as well. Is that something, as you founded, ISB, Ashoka, and now of course with Parappa, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Is that something you think about? What is the ethos and the sort of brand that I want to project? And is that something you constantly think about and want to evolve with time? How do you actually, do that thinking in the background?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there are 2 or 3 things that I think about for brand in education. One is that people are inherently suspicious of education and private education, which is the challenge and an opportunity. The opportunity is that the challenge is that they are suspicious because people promise and don't deliver. The opportunity is that you deliver what you promise. And that's what I have always done. I've said, listen, this is what I'm promising, and I make sure, damn sure, that I deliver. I don't overpromise and underdeliver, because then you played the game that everybody else is paying and people will swat you away. So I think the first thing about the education brand is whatever you promise, you deliver, and that is the opportunity, because nobody is doing that. So even if you were to deliver not A level, if you deliver B level or even C level, but you're delivering what you said at C level,
right,
your credibility will be sky high. That's number one. I think the second thing is you have to deliver outcomes in India. You can do liberal arts, you can do MBA, you can do design. If people are not seeing outcomes, and by outcomes, I mean jobs or admission into a top-notch master's program, then you're finished. We cannot expect an expensive, high quality education is going to be expensive. Whether you are paying for it or a scholarship student is immaterial. High quality education is expensive. In India, you cannot settle by saying, hey, I'm giving you a high quality education. Just be happy that you are getting good learning. I'm not obligated to give you outcomes.
right.
You can't say that. You have to focus on outcomes. So that's a second very important thing that I think those are 2 very important things that I think go into the building of a good education brand in the country.
And as you think about these types of well, not businesses with ventures, right? Ashoka, ISB. ISB is of course now gone and expanded over the last years into Mohali with a different campus. Was that ever, or is that ever part of the plan at Ashoka? Because even today, if I think about the liberal arts landscape, there isn't so much going on, right? Like you mentioned Flame and Ashoka, but there haven't been so many others that have come up that have been credible. So has that ever been part of the plan to take this model and replicate across the country as well?
No, Angad, we are very happy to support others who want to do this. And we did that with Kriya. I'm doing that with another university in Chennai called Sai University. And we are very open about encouraging others and supporting them. It was never the plan at ISB, and that's a whole different story. But there's been learnings for me from that also. I think the ISB Hyderabad Mohali structure, and I can again talk a little bit about that later, but or some other time. But it's a very unique structure where we consciously avoided the setting up of a second campus, which felt like a second class campus.
Yeah.
And we've been very successful at that. So when Bain comes to recruit, they don't say, oh, I'll go only to Hyderabad, because the Hyderabad is older and the best guys are there. And we've made that happen. It goes back to the outcome point, right? And our commitment to students that, hey, we will not allow people to differentiate between campuses. So you'll have the same experience, same quality, everything. It's one ISB. Most institutions have not been able to do that. It's very difficult to do. Even between ISB, INSEAD in France and INSEAD in Singapore, it's clearly a pecking order. We don't want. But achieving that is extremely, extremely difficult. And I think that I would not want to attempt that within Ashoka. I would rather put in those energies into the current campus and expand the campus. And that's our plan. We are at 2,000 students. We have a plan to go to 10,000 students. And 10,000 students, by the way, is still a decently small size university by US standards, by the Ivy League standards. So I think we can do a very high quality institution. We have a lot of headroom to grow, and we want to focus on that and really make it a top-notch institution.
Got it. And from there, of course, now you've picked an interesting for-profit venture in Harappa, which is more scalable in much more than higher education, and comes with some other challenges, but doesn't come with some of the challenges you grappled with around having land and regulations and things like that. So can you walk us through what the thinking was to go there? Is that a natural extension of, look, I have participated in post-graduation, undergraduation, and now I want to participate in sort of what comes next, or skilling in the professional world? Was that the thinking of just covering all those bases?
Sort of, Angad. See, I have been very interested in the larger topic of leadership and what develops people's leadership skills, right? As you realize over time, the area in which you got educated, the technical skills you picked up matter less and less, right, for all of us. So I got interested in this issue when I was at McKinsey. In fact, I left McKinsey to join ABP because, again, I was interested in more in the leadership aspects of running an institution and building the leadership capacity. That didn't work out. And in the creation of ISB, I tried very hard to bring in those elements in the MBA program. But that's when the academics took over, right? Because, in an MBA program, it's 1 year, you have to be taught finance, you need to be taught, it's a professional degree. So there was not much room, and I tried, but I don't think I was very successful. Then liberal arts further taught me that there is a way to teach this stuff, right? That reading and writing is the one thing that everybody should do, right? If you didn't do that, you don't know how to think. And I'm sorry to sound provocative, but it really is true that if you cannot read multiple pages of text, think it through, write it down, you will never develop your faculties of thinking. Right? Now, we do that at Ashoka, but then we do that at an expense where, again, we are not going into the full aspect of leadership development, which is, yeah, we teach how to communicate, but business communication is very different, right? And that I learned at McKinsey. So I started to see that liberal arts education was at another extreme, right? And business education was at the other extreme. And then obviously we all know that when you look at the real world and you look at this whole frustration that employers have with recruits and recruits have with not getting enough from the college they went to, the big gap is really these, what I have zeroed in on: cognitive, social, and behavioral skills, right? Which is your ability to think, your ability to communicate, work in teams, problem solve. And nobody is teaching you that. Now, the big question is, anybody teach, can it be taught? I think absolutely. Yeah. McKinsey taught me this because they took a metallurgy undergrad, a robotics PhD, and and I was not a problem solver in this. I thought I was a great problem solver, but I wasn't till I got there. I was a very poor communicator when it came to this world. I had written a dozen papers, but those papers were very poor in terms of communication. And that's why people like you and me hate reading academic journals, right? When you can't even make out what the people are saying. So I realized that it can be taught, it can be learned, but it needs to be taught and made aware to people at an early stage. Because once you become 40 and 50, you don't change. It's very difficult to change. It's very difficult for me to change. So how do you catch people young? And I gave up on the fact that schools, colleges are not going to incorporate this stuff very easily because they don't get it. The academics don't get it. Like, an academic has never been taught the importance of giving and receiving feedback. I use this example with all my academic friends, and I've given it to deans and presidents of US universities, and they say, yeah, you know what? What do you teach in giving and receiving feedback? I'd love to know that, because I've had to give feedback to people and I don't know how to do that, right? So academics don't get this either. So I said, listen, I'm going to have to teach this outside. Now, how do I do it? That's when online came to the rescue, right? When online started taking off, I said, this is the answer, right? The best way to overlay this into every program, everywhere, is to say this is available online. This is like my library, but now the library is not a passive library, right? I can hound you to take my course. Once you sign up for my course, I can hound you to take the classes, to complete it, to give you a grade and certify you. And obviously I have done enough stuff in terms of scale at the offline level. I also, the big advantage is that with online, you can actually do it at a much larger scale. The biggest thing I see in the online is that you can take an ISB or an Ashoka or an Ivy League education to everyone, right? So I have our Harappa courses are now going out in Hindi, and it's the same quality, right? Why should I, guys sitting in Patna or Saharanpur, not get the same quality of a content as a guy sitting in Delhi or Bombay, right? So it's a great level up. And so for me, that's what Harappa is to, again, fill a gap. To this gap point, I'm a big about gap and what problem am I trying to solve. So this problem is really the problem of what we call thrive skills. These are the skills that make you thrive in your life and in your career. We are in the business of teaching thrive skills. And just as MBA is a discipline around which you can build an institution, liberal arts is a discipline around which you can build an institution, design is a discipline around which you can build an institution. My case here is that there's thrive skills around which I'm building an institution. And with thrive skills at the core, I can teach many other things. You know, tomorrow, if people want to learn management or design or law, they can do that around my thrive skills.
You know, it's an interesting thing you said with the internet and content being consumed online and that taking off, it presented you with a lot of opportunities to scale some of these ideas. Now, there's, of course, a just tremendous activity going on in the broader edtech scene in India, right? So there would be a lot of gaps that you may have seen or are seeing even, you know, as we speak, being fulfilled by different sorts of folks. What made you choose this one in particular? Was it this idea of, look, I see people are relatively poor at communicating, or I see the lack of leadership, and I want to take that and then address it through the online means? Because there's, of course, there's K-12, there's now KG that's happening online. There's all of these different spaces with all these well-funded companies also jumping in. So what made you do that?
Bunch of reasons. First is that, remember I said, I wanted to do I knew that to build a successful business, I needed to do something that I was passionate about. I'm not passionate about teaching digital marketing. I'm not passionate about teaching design thinking. I'm not passionate about teaching AI and ML online, which is where a lot of people are making lots of money, at least in the higher education space. It's not for me. And if I had to do that, I'd go back to running Ashoka and ISB and making them much better. It doesn't fire me up. And I know that to be successful as a business, I need to be fired up. So this was an area that I had been thinking a lot about for almost 20, 25 years since my McKinsey days. And I cared about it. And I said, listen, I have to do something that I feel passionately about. So that has been a big driver of picking this over other things. And second, there's some calculation here or strategy here. Listen, these types of things that educational institutions are already teaching, they will continue to teach and they will make a successful transition online. And I will not be able to match the credibility of an MIT on digital marketing,
right,
or AI. And tomorrow, every kid is going to study the MIT AI course. Just as, you know, you want to solve those of you who have children, you want to solve any science or tech problem, math problem for your kid, you go to Khan Academy, right? It's high quality. Why do you need to go anywhere else? You don't need to go anywhere else. You just go to Salman Khan's lectures and you're done. So I think the same thing is going to happen. The highest credibility institutions or professors are going to cream the market when it comes to a particular subject or technical discipline. My bet is that there isn't anybody who's creaming the market in these areas that I've got, because it's not yet under the sort of the hood of the academics. It's kind of outside of that space. So it gives me some runway. Now, the truth is that places like LinkedIn Learning and Udemy and Udacity and all are already picking up on this. But the good news is that from my perspective, a communication course or a writing course is getting lost in the 60,000 courses that they're giving. So I'm banking on the fact that till they get wise, or till a Harvard or a MIT get wise, I have a runway to say, hey, Harappa is about Thrive skills, right? And so I'm cornflakes for breakfast like Kellogg, or, I'm Intel Inside like the chip. That's what I'm trying to do. And I feel passionate about it. So why not?
And is that, I was actually going to ask you this. I was like, there are LinkedIn and these guys are of course trying to sell soft skills as well through their broader learning platforms. But you're right. When I think of LinkedIn, there's 30 other things that come to my mind. When I think of Coursera or Udemy, there's 30 other things. And
Anga, very quickly, they are not focused on outcomes.
Yes.
So they're saying, I have a library. You join my library and read a book every week. I'm saying, yeah, come read my book, but I want you to actually practice this, and I'll make you practice this. I'll make you a better speaker. That goes back to the brand point. I'm delivering outcomes, and I'm going to deliver what I promise. Sorry, don't mean to interrupt.
No, not at all. One of the interesting things that I've seen with some other Indian edtech companies, like let's take an Upgrad now. While of course they are doing a lot more of the taking traditional online, so degrees online, but they are also focusing on outcomes in that they are trying to tie up jobs in the back end. Is that something that you also see integral as part of what you're trying to do with
Yes.
Harappa?
Yes. So we are starting a careers office, and we will over time enable people to upskill themselves. And hey, at the end of the day, a good education program does filtering for the employer, right?
Yeah.
So if there are people who are creaming through my communication courses and somebody is looking for a great communications guy who's also got Python, I'll be able to serve them up that person. If they just want Python, they may be able to get it from an Upgrad or a Simply Learn or whatever. But if they're looking for somebody with Python and communication skills and team leadership skills, then I will be the only one who'll be able to guarantee them that.
And just switching gears a little bit to the broader sector, which of course you have very deep insights on, having been part of it in different capacities. What has COVID been like for the sector as a whole, in higher education in particular, where you know it so well? And what kind of step changes do you think it's going to affect over the next couple of years, and already has? I know we were having some conversations before we started the formal interview, but how do you actually see that change things for the Indian landscape?
So listen, in the short term, COVID has wreaked havoc, right? Let me not make any bones about the fact that for a formal student who's enrolled in school or college, it's been a disaster. Because schools and colleges have pivoted and everybody can pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, we were able to take care and deliver. But it's been havoc, right? Exams getting cancelled. And learning is not just about transmitting knowledge. It's about peer learning. It's about the social aspects of learning. It's been a complete havoc. People, I'm afraid that is, for some people, half their college education of a 3-year program is gone, right, in this mess. So I think let's acknowledge that. But I think the state of art in education has been advanced by at least 5 years because of COVID. And the real issue in India, for India particularly, I think it'll do a huge amount for kids who are self-motivated to learn, but don't have access, have not yet realized that there's high quality content that is available for them to access. So the fact that you now have high quality content as an alternative to the teacher in the classroom, if you want to learn, right? I mean, the problem with online education is that a lot of it is passive.
Yeah.
But the fact is, I learned all my physics from Resnick and Halliday, 2 books written by 2 professors at Purdue who none of us ever met, didn't see, but the books were great. I think the same thing is going to happen with online. So if you really want to learn something, if you want to learn calculus, you can actually go online and learn. And now you're used to it. And now if your math teacher is enlightened, he will point you to the calculus lectures that he thinks are good for you and get you to learn. So I think learning outcomes for people in formal school and colleges are going to go up substantially. And the big quality challenge that we have in India, this could be a big game changer for us, because we are not going to be able to build enough classrooms and find enough good teachers to train our kids. So we have to see online as the only answer to provide quality, affordable education to our kids in this country. Otherwise, the old model will not work. It has to be a blended or by the way, in many cases, it will be an online only model for our kids. So that's the one big shift that is going to happen in India. The second big shift, and which is the same point, is that this idea of lifelong learning is going to become a reality now, because people are realizing, most of the people, by the way, who take Harappa courses, 2/3 of them are 25 years and above. 1/3 of the people are 35 years and above. We are already seeing that. And we built these courses for people who are in their early 20s, right? But people are having FOMO and they're saying, hey, I didn't get this stuff. It's like the dean saying, I didn't get the feedback session. I want to go learn how to give feedback. So I think this lifelong learning thing is becoming much more accessible, because you can learn whatever you want and just in time and convenient. And this is not just some pipe dream. People are already doing that. I have evidence that people are doing that.
And sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to play that forward and say, let's take a 3 to 5 year view. What are some of the areas of Indian education, both from a regulatory standpoint as well as from a technology and sort of forward-looking standpoint, that you're most excited about? And do you actually see some of these models going global, and not just serving India, but also serving other countries and students from across the world?
I think so. I think that's already happening, by the way. A lot of the Indian edtech providers, I mean, Simply Learn is a great example, where they've decided to just focus on the markets abroad. And they've done a great hybrid model where they have actually reduced the cost using technology to provide very high quality outcome-based programs in the tech space, right? So absolutely, I think a lot. See, the thing is, people have to see this space as a game changer from an edtech and from an innovation perspective out of India. Because in the West, the challenge is substituting high cost brick and mortar education with more affordable online education. Here, the bigger challenge is, how do you reach the unreachable?
Yeah. And
how do you motivate the last kid who doesn't even have the opportunity to go to a brick and mortar institution and sit in a classroom with other kids and feel, the same motivational juices as we would feel sitting in a classroom? So I think the innovation challenge for us is huge. And I think Indian companies and Indian entrepreneurs will respond to the challenge and come up with stuff that is really innovative. That's the opportunity. It would be a missed opportunity if we didn't exploit that. I think the other thing I will say is that there's a huge dearth of India-based content. At least in higher education, there's nothing.
Yeah.
Is there a high-quality Indian history course that is available? And I'm telling you, if I get one of the Ashoka professors to do a proper online Indian history course, every Indian and every Indian abroad and lots of people who are interested in Indian history will want to take that course. Because today, history is not taught in a manner that is engaging. But it can be done in a Netflix documentary fashion and made as engaging and enthralling as that. That's the opportunity that we have.
I'm going to use the last 5-7 minutes that we have with you on a little bit more personal topics, which is talking about your journey as an entrepreneur. And there were different hats like we've spoken about that you've worn. Today there's so much content or advice out there, and you see so much information there about funding rounds, about these young entrepreneurs, right? Wherein anyone who's sort of young out of college in India, at least I see that a lot with my peers as well, is just itching to kind of go out there and do something, no matter what that is. You of course embraced entrepreneurship at a later stage in your life. You spent time in McKinsey, you've done a PhD by then. Is there a right time to do this? How would you think about what is the right time to actually jump? And I know you said I did some of this for all the wrong reasons. So what are the right reasons, and what is the right time according to you?
So the right reason is that firstly, you must want to be an entrepreneur. People get excited by their idea and want to become an entrepreneur. That's the wrong reason to be an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurship is like, you want to raise children. Don't get excited about the sex that comes before having the child, right? So, the exciting part is dating somebody and getting married and, the physical relationship. But, you really want to have kids if you want to do all this. So not to use a misplaced analogy, but the point is you have to love the idea of taking risk and building something first and foremost, rather than saying, I'm excited about specialty media, which is what happened to me at 9.9. So that's the first thing. The second is, then you pick an idea, and those ideas can be multiple. All entrepreneurs have multiple ideas. But pick an idea not because somebody else is doing it or because somebody told you to or some banker came and sold you a business. Pick an idea because you feel passionately about it. And your passion may be misplaced and you may be proven wrong. That's the risk you are taking. But don't do anything without feeling really hugely inspired and motivated by what you're trying to do. To me, those are the two important things to get started. The last thing I will say is measure your risks very carefully. When people leave late, a lot of McKinsey people call me saying, can I become an entrepreneur? I say, how much money have you made? Right? Because if you work 10 years at McKinsey, you better put some good money aside so that you don't have to worry about, whether you have the money or not, or whether you've got money enough for kids' education or you're old. So in the early stages of life, you don't have to worry so much because you don't have the obligations. But don't do stuff which is going to put pressure on you, which is outside of the business pressure. You personally should feel secure that you can take the financial and social and familial risk associated with that and measure that very carefully. Most times people can't measure that because you're so excited about the business you want to build that you're willing to throw everything to the wind. There, having a mentor who sits you down and says, boss, how much money do you have? How old are you? What risk can you take? Do you have a roof over your, you have a wife and kid. How are you going to manage? Somebody needs to get that stuff sorted out before you jump in. Those are my kind of quick 3 pieces of advice.
Two things that I wanted to touch upon with you, which is one, really how important is it to build that sort of tribe of supporters and mentors? And like you said, you jumped in at a later stage in your life. Was it equally important for you as it would be for someone as young as Yash or me? And to the flip side, how important is it to have sort of your familial buy-in into the vision that you're going after? And did you have sort of experiences that were hard to navigate on that aspect of things of ensuring that your family is part of that vision? And how hard was that to navigate, really?
No, firstly, don't worry about anybody other than your spouse and kids. My mother still doesn't know what I do. And my father and mother always told me, don't become a businessman. And I had it ingrained in my head till I realized when I grew up and became wiser that my father was a businessman. He ran a printing press. We never thought of ourselves a business family, but he did. So, people have these misconceived notions and so on. And, oh, so-and-so uncle burnt his fingers, so don't do this. They sold the family jewels or they ran the business to the ground. Wo hamare blood mein nahi hai. All that nonsense goes on. I think you have to cut that out. Friends also will give conflicting advice. So cut that out. The only implication is for your immediate family. And I think that's an important implication to have. Right? It should be very calculated. If your wife or your husband is going to support you, that's fantastic. Grab the opportunity. It's like your parents paying for your education, right? If my parents were willing to pay for a Stanford or a Penn education when I was an undergrad, I would have gone there. So my point is, grab the opportunity. If you have a supportive spouse and you're not too hung up about, whether you are making the money or they are making the money, grab the opportunity and do it. But it needs to be an explicit understanding, and for your sake. It's not about a contract, because I think I'm saying all this because I have lived the other life. I think I jumped into it without having adequate financial security, and that compromised me, because what would happen is that because I needed the financial security, I would start doing stuff on the side which was not so focused, because I needed to make some consulting money to keep my fires burning at home, right? So that would take that has an opportunity cost for the business, right?
Yep.
You stay awake at night saying, yeah, I've frittered away all my savings. And that's the other mistake I made. I did not ring fence my savings, right? I'm okay, and I'm not complaining, and I'm okay now, but I've gone through those periods, right? I did stupid things, like in those days I had money, so I would start doing angel investing in other, and you don't step back and say, hey, I'm running the biggest risk already. Why do I need to take more risk? Right? And why should I take a risk on Yash's company and Angad's company when I should be, if I had the money to take risk, let me take on mine. But why am I wasting my time investing elsewhere? So I think some financial and practical prudence is also important. One should not get completely dreamy-eyed and carried away by the emotion of building a new business. I think that's very important.
Well, thank you, Pramath. I know we're at time, but this has been incredibly insightful, very transparent and honest. So thanks so much for taking the time out to be here and speak with us.
Thank you for having me. It was great. I think you're a great interviewer, by the way, huh? You really kept the conversation going, and you asked really good questions, which very few interviewers have really probed me as much as you did. And I was very surprised. We've never met other than a quick prep call, but you have an alternative career, Angad.
I'll know where to look for funding when I do that. So thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks, Pramath, again.
Thank you so much, Pramath.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.